Hey, I want to thank everybody who's attending today. The conversation is going to be on caterpillars from around the country. I do want to mention that there's a lot of information I'll be sharing today, and we will be putting this onto our website afterwards. So for those of you that can't write nearly as fast as I can speak, you'll be able to go back to that and find all the information you may need on any one of these caterpillars that may be of interest to you. So we'll go ahead and get started. And one of the questions that I'm always curious about is, what are the reasons that trees decline? And I strongly suspect that if you think about what you believe the reasons to be, they will be as different as mine were from the reality. One of the important questionnaires that went out discovered that really very little relating to insects and fungi and mites comparative to abiotic causes were the reasons for tree decline. So abiotic was a much larger chunk than any of the others. A second survey that was conducted found that abiotic causes were even more significant for the reasons for tree decline. In fact, abiotic causes represent some 29 to 41% of tree decline. I would have guessed that number to be a whole lot lower, which tells us that far and distinct from insect and disease problems, we need to be worrying about what else is causing problems to trees. Let's talk about some of the terms you're going to hear today. When we talk about a sign, it's a visual evidence of the actual organism. So some part of a disease, like their fruiting bodies or their mycelia, or some stage of the insect, like a larva, a nymph, adult, an egg, or a pupa. When we talk about symptoms, they're different. It's the effect that that pest or disease has on the plant. So we'd be thinking about evidence of feeding, or brown leaves, or decay, boring tunnels, discolored wood, maybe even slower internodal growth, and definitely smaller plant parts. All of these would be symptoms, whereas the signs are the actual organism. Then we break things down a little bit further. You heard me mention that abiotic causes are the main reason that plants decline. These are physical issues, declines not caused by a living organism, like site conditions, weather, soil conditions, how deep something was planted. All of these affect plant health, whereas biotic factors are related to or resulting from other living organisms like insects and diseases, which affect plant health. How we define a disease is a progressive disruption of normal functioning in the plant. It could be any part of the plant, a stem, a twig, a root, a leaf, or it could be systemic, involving or invading multiple structures in a plant. Diseases in plants are typically fungal or bacterial, and most tree decay is caused by fungi. Bacterial attacks often begin in the leaf tissue, may progress into the twigs and stems. Fire blight is a good example of that type of a disease. And weather conditions play a huge role in the spread of diseases. Many require moisture or humidity to multiply, to spread, or to reproduce. When we get into insects, it's often hard to define what an insect is, but they're small arthropod animals having 6 to 8 legs, and they're typically segmented. The life stages that we're going to talk about today of insects are either called eggs, pupa, larvae, nymphs, or adults. And in the case of caterpillars, it's primarily larvae, not nymphs. The adults, of course, being the reproductive phase. In most of the insects we're going to talk about today, we'll be talking about complete metamorphosis. So they go from egg to larva to pupa to adult. The timing may be very different, but that's the general progression. Whereas incomplete metamorphosis goes from egg to various generations of nymphs to adults. So caterpillars have complete metamorphosis. Spotted lanternfly is an example of incomplete metamorphosis. And typically, only one stage of the insect damages trees, a larva, a nymph, an adult. But in some beetles, both larvae and adults can feed on different parts of the tree. So for instance, in emerald ash borer and elm leaf beetle, we have two different generations, or two different life stages rather, that will in fact damage trees. Insect predators also feed in the same places as pests are found. So you need to know what pest you've got to determine if what you're looking at is really the pest or a predator that's actually helping you to control these insects. Over here on the left, you see a caterpillar that's a larva, and the pupa from one of the caterpillars, the spongy moth. So I like to break the insects down into groups. Leaf skeletonizers, they leave leaf veins generally intact, and while they're still chewing insects, they can easily be narrowed down by the type of damage that they've caused, this whole lacing effect that you see on Japanese beetles. Chewing insects or caterpillars and beetles, they may stop at the veins, but they have many very irregular chewed areas. And then there's the piercing and sucking, such as the lace bug. It extracts nutrients from the leaves and needles by that piercing and sucking, and it causes stippling and browning, as is evident on the sycamore on the left. And then lastly, boring insects, what we generally used to view as impossible to control in the early days of my treatment of trees. But they feed or bore into xylem and phloem, they seek nutrients, they reproduce, they lay eggs, and they grow. One of the things that I often have to talk about is what I'll call pest mimics. These are cultural and planting site issues. Site conditions can mimic damage from pests or diseases, organisms, and these are things that are stressing tree systems out. And the declining trees really appear diseased in many cases. And while there's no causal organism present, the results can be just as bad. When we talk about plant issues where there's no causal organism present, we often refer to these things as cultural problems. So site conditions can limit root development, they can kill roots, they reduce adequate photosynthetic surfaces, it impacts food and nutrient supply, and water movement. In this example on the far right side, micronutrient deficiencies caused by alkaline soils in a camphor. Very much resembles a serious problem, but it's actually nutrient-based, pH-based. So another question I like to ask is this treatment method important when you're trying to control pests? And I want to talk about that for a few moments before we get into the specifics on the pests of today. Effectiveness, longevity, and productivity vary considerably among all the different methods that you could use to treat trees. Soil drenches and soil injections, some of the strengths and weaknesses here. They have annual limits per acre, so they limit you on how much of this product you can use and apply to the soil. In the soil, there are microbial degradations, so things break down quicker in the soil than they do in the tree. Of course, the groundwater risks are the reasons that they have annual limits per acre, and they are slower to the target pest. The chemistry is often less expensive, but with annual retreatment and the additional labor costs, it sort of tends to balance itself out. And then, of course, there are the consumer environmental concerns that seem to be increasing, where people just don't want you pouring things into the ground anymore. Bark sprays, they're easy to apply. Their risk of runoff and leaching still exists. They've still got to travel through the bark. And they're really best on smaller, thin bark trees. And they do have shorter residuals in general. And there are, of course, annual limits per acre in most of these as well. And you as the applicator are, of course, more exposed because you're spraying up in the air to cover the bark. There are cambial injections. These are fast, but their high pressure can actually split the bark. And the equipment that you use in these cambial injections limits the dose that can be injected. Often people couple this type of an application with soil drenches to get the best control of the pest. Splashback is very common on this type of system. There are foliar cover sprays, which have in the past been the really go-to for caterpillar pest control. They reduce or control the feeding of leaf-feeding pests. They don't control borers, which can kill trees, of course. But there are so many limitations, having experienced them in many cases myself. Weather, especially during the spring, really limit its use. Wind, rain, timing, off-target spray, and what is the insect stage that I'm trying to control and when. There are caps. They've been around a long time and depend upon the uptake conditions, how healthy is the tree, and other environmental factors. They operate at very low pressure, around 6 psi. So I'm seeing less use of these due to slower uptake efficiencies, where productivity continues to drive our business and demand that we are able to get in and get out faster and get on to the next customer. Then there's microinfusion. There's a wide range of equipment choices for various situations, plugged or plugless, a variety of pressures to meet your needs. Plugs allow for rapid close over of injection sites. The last one I'll talk about here is macro infusion, which was invented for Dutch elm treatments. Requires large volumes of water. It is slow. It requires root exposure before injection. And it is losing favor among applicators due to the time challenges, the water use demands, and better alternatives. So what do we use and how do we use it? This is a question that is always on your mind and needs to be as we figure out what is the best way to protect your customer's property and also to be economical and efficient. Let's just generally talk about caterpillars for a moment and kind of cover some of the basics here. Leaf feeding caterpillars obviously feed on leaf tissue, sometimes severely. Sometimes they just cause aesthetic damage. That means, it's not really hurting the plant. It may be more of an issue if the customer complains than it is to the plant. On the other hand, other caterpillars bore, mine, tunnel, girdle, or totally disrupt cambial function. Those are much more serious caterpillars, and we'll talk about some of them today. Most of them exhibit complete metamorphosis from egg to larva with multiple instars, and then they form a pupa, in which of course develops into the reproductive moth. Some are selective, feeding on limited species, and then some feed on pretty much whatever's in front of them, and we refer to them as polyphagous. Their feeding habits can and do change based on their population density or life cycle stage. In the case of the spongy moth, it tends to prefer oak trees, but I've seen it feed on everything and anything when their populations are too high, and they will devour whatever is there for survival. During peak egg infestations, egg masses can exceed 300,000 eggs in a single tree, and I've seen that myself here with the spongy moth. These are some examples of caterpillars eggs being laid, hatching, developing, and then eventually reaching a pupal stage. This all happens to be the spongy moth, formerly called the gypsy moth. Typically, the hatch of eggs into larvae coincides with new leaf development, new leaf emergence. But there are some late season feeders that are quite different. They're insects that are like the fall webworm. But remember, spring defoliation is more important than later leaf loss, because right after the leaves have emerged, they take a lot of energy out of the tree. And when they have to do that a second time in a few months, if they're defoliated, that can be a life or death situation for trees. Whereas by the fall, the trees have sufficiently stored enough carbohydrates that they do not really suffer from fall defoliation. Adult moths hatch, they mate, they typically follow pupation just after a few weeks, but some, like the winter moth we'll talk about later, have delayed moth hatch into the late fall. Timing is really critical. As caterpillars hatch at leaf out, there's no room for error. Sprays are less effective at damage control because, quite frankly, we don't have enough leaf tissue when they first hatch out. Sometimes the bad weather, wind, rain, and in the spring, wind is our biggest enemy, really limit when we can actually treat trees by early season sprays. Some treatments can be made just in time, while others can be applied in the early fall of the preceding year to protect those trees the following spring. So control choices do depend on life cycle. Things like, when does the leaf feeding stage hatch? How long is the residual of the insect control you're using after you treat? What are the weather impacts, good, bad, otherwise? Do these insects feed in webs or by themselves? And sometimes what chemistry you end up using is dictated by the type of equipment you own or that you're going to purchase. Here are 4 examples of the types of insects, caterpillars that you might be running into normally in the season. Some of the common caterpillar insecticidal choices I'll mention below are things that are just a part of the possible list of insecticides that you might use. Products like Arborjet, it's a fast-acting injectable that lasts about 60 days, and it kills insects by contact and by stomach, and it's very fast. This is a form of acephate, which is used in foliar sprays. It's also fast-acting, but very short-lived. A product like spinosad, it's organic, it's a stomach and contact with a short residual, sometimes known as conserve. That is how it's sold. There are botanicals with essential oils. There's BT, which is bacterial, targeting specific caterpillars. And they're only effective in the early larval life cycle stages. They also disrupt stomach and our stomach poisons. There are products like emamectin benzoate, such as Triage, which offers season-long injectable protection because it paralyzes the insects and they can't feed. So these are some of the most common types of insecticides we'll talk about today as I'm making recommendations, but there are more. Labels are the law, and you can easily Google anything you want to find out what the recommendations are, as long as they are early enough, or late enough rather, in their production, the information that they're useful to you. Let's talk about sprays for a minute, because let's face it, sprays are simple, but they all have their limitations. Sprayer height capacity. A JD9 gun reaches 30 feet. If you're going to employ a much bigger spray system, you really jack up the price tremendously. And then there are the spray rig costs with limited need. How often do you need to spray tall trees? There's leaf size coverage. We talked about those caterpillars that are hatching in the early spring often hatch out and start feeding before there's much leaf surface to cover. Of course, the wind issues and the off-target risks are a constant problem. And then the neighbors. It's becoming socially unacceptable in today's world to spray. Back when I was treating spongy moth in the early 1980s, we sprayed neighborhoods. We didn't spray trees. We sprayed everything. We sprayed houses. We sprayed whatever was nearby. No one would tolerate that any longer. Some spray systems only work on smaller larvae. Some of the organics and bacterials must be used in the first or second instars, or they're not effective. And honestly, sprays, in my mind, are best on smaller trees or at-risk shrubs. You eliminate all of the off-target issues and all of the costs associated with big tree spraying. Now, caterpillars do have natural predators, and we've seen them in action over and over again. I want to talk about a few of those today. Numerous ones exist to help you limit explosive caterpillar growth. The balance is disrupted, however, if weather allows for better survival of either the pest or the predator. In this particular case, it's important to know that high populations of caterpillars can actually spread viruses among themselves, while frequent spring rains and cool temperatures will spread the fungi. Two concurrent dry springs can result in caterpillar survival and high populations, leading to significant defoliation. We've seen that in the past with spongy moth here in the Northeast, 2016-17, into 2018, we had very dry springs and the populations exploded in the Northeast with incredible numbers of caterpillar eggs. Most pests have predatory insects, which also keep them in check. What I wanted to show you here is two different types of predators. One is a nuclear polyhedrous virus known as NPV. It is also used in some large government spraying known as GIP-check as one of the treatments. And it creates a caterpillar that starts to melt down from the inside. You can see the V-shaped inclination here as these caterpillars hang from the trees and collapse. It's a very characteristic sign. The other is a fungi. The entomophaga is going to desiccate the caterpillars on the tree, and they'll remain there for months afterwards, as is evident from these pictures that you see here. These all happen to be with the spongy moth in the New England area a few years ago. Caterpillars have natural predators, as I mentioned: rodents, birds, squirrels, chipmunks, raccoons, and of course the predatory insects like parasitic wasps. In this particular case, field mice removed over 7,000 eggs from fall to spring. And I know this because this is my property. So all these eggs on this tree represent a minimum of 500 eggs per each egg cluster. And by spring, they were all missing. And that only works particularly well if you've got low populations. We still had complete defoliation in this area, regardless of that activity. So it's time to talk about caterpillar pests from around the US. And I've tried to choose 15 pests that I think are most prominent, most visible, and ones that you will probably want to protect your customers against. But there are literally hundreds of caterpillars that feed to some level and some degree on trees. And some years they are bad and some years they're insignificant. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through this conversation today, and these are the insects that I hope to talk about. I'm not going to bother reading them. You can easily see them, but we'll go through these, and they're not in any particular order, north to south, east to west, spring to fall. I want to keep everybody entertained, so they'll go from one to the next pretty quickly. And what I plan to cover is I'll be talking about range. I'll be talking about life cycle, signs and symptoms, potential treatments. All of that will be included for each insect. But I did want to talk in general about the clear-winged borers because most people do not associate these as caterpillars. These are the pitch mast, the lilac, ash, and locust borers. The adults look like these, as you can see on the left-hand side here. I'd be very much nervous that that was going to sting me, but they're moths, and there are 38 different species in the US. The larvae are the ones that do the considerable damage, weakening trees. It's not by defoliation that the problem exists. These are insects that are boring into the trees. They can be present with other boring insects as well. The exit holes tend to be round or oval, and you'll often see sawdust at the place of the hole as compared to the emerald ash borer, which has a D-shaped exit hole and no sawdust. They do have 4 life stages, just like many caterpillars: egg to larva to pupa to adult. The eggs are laid, they bore into the bark, they feed in the cambium or even into the heartwood. They'll pupate, emerging as adults, and start over. These center images show the adults coming out of the trees. It's the most odd thing I've ever seen. And these were on trees that were already under attack from emerald ash borer. They attack ash, oak, willow, poplar, maple, peach apple, black gum, dogwood, and lilac. So it's a very wide range of hosts for them. And what I have found is that systemic injections reach the larvae feeding in those areas. Applied in the fall, you can reduce larval feeding damage. Emamectin benzoate is just one of those products that you can use in the fall to protect the tree, and it'll still be there for the next 2 years. These injectables give us that amazing control, an example of which is triage. So let's jump into each of these insects. The part that is most difficult to remember, but again, will be on our website so you can refer back to them along with the pictures and everything you need to see here. On the particular host plants for the Zimmerman pine tip moth, Scots, Austrian pines, firs, Douglas fir, spruce, mugo, and yet more. Their life cycle is a 1-year one. The adult moths emerge, which you can see here on the right, in late July to early August. And the adults only fly at night, so this is not something you're going to see flying around very commonly. The females will mate, lay eggs near the site of earlier wounds, and then as the eggs hatch within a week, the new caterpillars begin to feed and excavate a shallow pit, as you can see in the second picture, in the bark. They will protect themselves in a cocoon in the bark until spring. So that's as far as it goes in the fall. By early spring, the larvae will emerge, tunnel through the bark, feed in the phloem, and that's where all the damage is occurring. And importantly, they're attracted to trees that are already being wounded, which means trees that have either had the Zimmerman pine tip moth or trees that have suffered snow injury, winter injury, any kind of damage. So what is their range? They're an introduced species, and they're now in 23 northern states, plus the Pacific Northwest and California. Earlier symptoms will be wilting or browning of new growth. The infested terminals will have wilting, much like we often see with white pine weevil, and it'll tend to wilt and curve down. Severe infestations may cause entire tops to break and turn brown. There'll be a pitch mass near the branch whorls, and it'll be a popcorn-like mixture of resin and sawdust, as you can see from these images here. The limbs will break at branch unions in older trees. So even on trees that the top doesn't break off of, individual branches can break. And the caterpillars are often found in these sap clusters. If you pull them apart, you'll find these caterpillars that are about 3/4 of an inch in size. So what are our treatment options? Well, in the past, we did a lot of spraying of boles of trees, as you can see here. But you need to reduce the tree stress. That's an important way to limit pest attraction to the tree. So making sure that your pruning cuts are effective and timely, making sure that winter damage is addressed as quickly as possible. Full bowl sprays using permethrins we used in the early spring when caterpillars emerged, and then retreating in August to control young caterpillars. but timing is much a challenge. And of course, the potential to actually do bowl sprays is a challenging business in and of itself. Permethrins tend to be short-lived, which is why they recommend 2 applications a year. Injectable solutions offer longer residuals, and timing is not nearly as significant an issue for you. Treatment with products like emamectin benzoate, such as Triage R10, provide long-lasting and effective control in conifers. And the reason that that is so effective is it's a lower dose insecticide, so it's easier to inject coniferous trees that have resin. Let's move on now to the winter moth. Winter moth is an interesting one. It's more of an East Coast problem, more of a Northeast problem, but you've probably heard about it. It attacks a wide range of species: maples, oaks, apples, crab apples, ash, basswood, and it goes on. The life cycle, this is an interesting one. Up to 300 eggs will be laid in the bark cracks and crevices and along twigs and near leaf buds, which you'll see in the next slide. In the late fall, early winter, strange time to be laying eggs. They overwinter as those eggs, and they change color, going from green to red-orange to blue-black before they finally hatch in the spring. The eggs will hatch as the temperatures reach 55 degrees, which is typically right around the time of bud break on these trees in the Northeast. If you have a slower bud break, as we're having this year, there may be increased mortality because there's no food for the caterpillars to feed on. The newly emerging caterpillars will enter the swelling bud scales before you even detect them and damage leaves inside the buds. So as the leaves start to grow, they're already damaged. Here you can see the eggs on the left, what the larvae look like as they reach maturity, the pupa on the right, and the 2 different male and female moths associated with winter moth. New caterpillars start out black and very tiny, the size of eyelashes, which is why they can get under the swelling bud scales. But then the young larvae will balloon on their silken threads to move on to other trees, and they'll completely defoliate them and move from one tree to the next over large distances. Here you can see the eggs on the bud, how tiny they are. And once again, the moths, male and female on the left, are mating. The male and female evident there as well. And on the far bottom left, you can see just how many caterpillars can be on a tree. Mature larvae are only 1 inch long. So when they're younger, they're much tinier. They'll start to pupate in the soil by about May to early June. So this is a really interesting pest. So pupation takes place in the soil. The adults don't emerge until mid-November. So the moths are present all the way into January when air temperatures are warm enough, and they will be flying near your outdoor lights. The range is central Mass and eastern Connecticut, coastal Maine, southeastern New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. So truly a northeastern pest. The picture on the left really shows you how severely they can defoliate a tree. Leaf feeding is the obvious sign that you're going to see. Caterpillars will be there in large numbers in the spring, but they're often confused with spanworms or cankerworms. So what are the treatment options? Well, timing and treatment methods are the real challenges for you. There are biologicals like spinosad, BT, azosol, sprayed very early in the caterpillar development, but the problem with those treatments is that the leaves are very tiny and they've already started to suffer damage because they're not well expanded, but these caterpillars are inside the bud scales. Spring injection or sprays with acephate are just-in-time solutions, and fall treatments with emamectin can reduce spring impacts when you know you've got a serious problem. Now I'll get to one more eastern pest, a brown-tailed moth, who has become more and more of a problem as conditions have expanded for them to spread. They prefer oaks, apples, cherries, hawthorn, pear, and hardwoods of all sorts. Their life cycle is in August to September, a caterpillar hatch. So the caterpillars are present in the early summer. By late summer, the caterpillars are hatching. They're creating overwintering webs in the trees. So this is important. These are not feeding late into the fall, but they're creating overwintering webs and under objects and in trees with anywhere from 25 to 400 larvae per web. By spring, the larvae become active again, leaving their webs, and they feed on new leaf buds. The young larvae will return to webs nightly, And then as they get larger, they'll stop going back to their webs and start to feed on the tree leaves and stay on the tree leaves throughout the entire day. By late June, the larvae have reached their full size. That's when they spin their cocoons to pupate. And in July, the pupa develop into the moths, which we now see as well. The females will lay a large number of eggs on limb undersides, and these eggs are covered in brown hairs. By fall, the eggs hatch, feed, and make webs to overwinter. Sounds like a pretty unusual life cycle, but let's talk about more and why this is a problem. The heaviest outbreaks are occurring in Maine and Canada, but can be found in eastern Massachusetts as well. Some of the signs and symptoms: by late summer, these collective and protective webs are being developed. You can see evidence of this in the leaves and in the branches. The females will also lay eggs covered in protective hairs, as you can see on the bottom left-hand side. They tend to feed in groups for a while, as you can see in the bottom middle, and then they become independent later. The adults are attracted to light and are nocturnal, so you're not going to see these male and females during the day. So what is the treatment for them? Well, the sprays have got to occur in early spring after the caterpillars hatch and feeding begins, much like many caterpillars need to be protected by spray. But for best control, treatment can be injected. You can use acephate and emamectin in the early spring, which is going to give you fast action and long lasting, or emamectin in early fall to protect for next spring, such as products like Arborjet and Triage R10. One of the biggest concerns with the brown-tail moth is not the defoliation they cause, but rather the human risk. Second and third instars have hairs, they call them setae, that break off, cause severe rash and breathing difficulties, and the rashes can persist for weeks. The hairs are barbed and they become lodged in the skin. So this is one of the biggest concerns. In 2022, they're expecting one of the most severe pest issues with brown-tail moth that they've ever seen. All right, let's move on to fall webworm, switching gears completely here. What are the host plants? American elm, black walnut, pecan, black cherry, hickory, mulberry, and in addition, another 85 different trees across the country. The eggs are laid on the undersides of leaves. As you can see here, these are the eggs being laid on the right-hand side picture by the white moth. Caterpillars are present in late August to September in the north and earlier in the south. The larvae are variable in color. As you look at these two larvae on the left-hand side, one is yellowish, the other one is almost black. The larvae will feed for 6 to 8 weeks in the trees. Then they pupate for the winter in the bark or the leaf litter near the tree. The adult moths will then appear again in May to August. From March in the south, because it's an earlier season, then they'll mate, lay eggs, and die. So what is their range? Native to all of North America, but there are different pest choices across the country. Initially, the larvae will feed on leaf surfaces, so you'll actually see some skeletonizing of the surface of the leaf before they grow larger and begin to eat all of it. They'll feed for 6 weeks in their web nests. As you can see evident here, all of these web nests are very typical. However, they feed at the end of branches, so it's a good way for you to differentiate them from things like the eastern tent caterpillar. And they increase the nest size as the defoliation occurs, so the nest continues to get larger and larger. And most other caterpillars are feeding much earlier in the spring. The moths range anywhere from pure white to speckled with black, and we tend to see more of the black speckling the further south in the range you go. In the wintertime, you'll see remnant nests and molted skins visible, like the picture on the bottom center. This is very common, and that also can help you as you visit new customers to know what you might need to prepare for the following year. So what are the treatments? Very much the same as most other caterpillars: biologicals, spinosad, BT, azosol, injectables like acephate, emamectin benzoate, like Arborjet or Triage. One of the important things that I wanted to stress here is the nature of these nests. Not only is it just a natural thing that they create, but these nests are also impermeable to water and therefore also to insect sprays. So one of the things that I have noticed is that as I'm trying to spray a caterpillar nest, if I cannot break through that nest, most of those caterpillars do not die, which is why injectables can be so effective, because as they go to feed on the leaves, they're much better controlled. They prefer many plants. I'm sorry, we're switching to Eastern Tent caterpillar, my bad. Preferring many plants. I find a lot of them are in the Prunus genus: plums, cherries, apples, wild cherries. And there's a unique difference here, which is evident from this center picture. Where are they feeding? They're feeding in the crotches of the trees. Their nests are in the crotches of the trees. They're not at the tips of the branches. There's one generation a year. Eggs are laid in a brittle mass that encircles a host twig. On the left here, you can see that mass. It almost feels like styrofoam. Hatch occurs like so many others near bud break, and they feed in nests in the crotches of the trees. The larval nests, just like in the fall webworm, protect the developing caterpillars. The larvae begin to feed away from the nest by the time they're 6 to 8 weeks into their development, and then they'll spin cocoons, as you can see in the bottom left-hand side here. The pupa will last in those cocoons for about 3 weeks, and then the adult moths will emerge somewhere in the summer months of late June to early July to lay their eggs and die. They range all the way out to the Rocky Mountains and into southern Canada, and I would not be surprised if their range is expanding on an annual basis. You'll see egg masses surrounding small twigs of the host. This is a close-up after the eggs have hatched, and this is a remnant of where the eggs were. The caterpillars have emerged from these egg hatches. You'll see nests of caterpillars in host trees, much as I've described to you in the branch crotches. Mature caterpillars are quite large, 2+ inches. They tend to be dark with a white stripe on their backs, and they will have lines of brown or yellow along their sides with blue spots. You can differentiate this very clearly from spongy moths, because the spongy moths, which I'll show you in a few minutes, have rows of red and then blue spots on their backs. Again, the same treatment methods: biological, spinosad, BT, azisol, injectables like acephate, which is a very fast-acting product, and memectin benzoate as well. Again, nest makers are difficult to spray and control. Bagworms is my next one, not one that you normally think of as a caterpillar. There are 1,300 plus species of bagworms. It's an enormous number. Most attack evergreens, some attack deciduous trees. The bag or the cocoon is made of various plant parts. So as you look at them, they will attach various plant parts, as you can see in this center top picture, to the cocoon. The damage is worse on conifers because whatever they do damage to doesn't grow back. Conifers are very different than we see with deciduous trees. So there'll be no foliage growing back on these, which is why they're the worst problem. Bagworm females will lay up to 1,000 eggs in the old cocoon, as you can see on the top left-hand side, the eggs in the cocoon. They overwinter in that cocoon, hatching in the spring, and then they leave the nest. The tiny bagworms will disperse again on silken threads, which is how they can wind blow to the next tree that they want to attack. The larva will go through 4 instars, then they construct a cocoon, and they begin to feed even more heavily. So their cocoon is the bag. As the larvae grow, they expand their bag, getting more and more visible, and that's when we begin to hear complaints from customers about these bagworms. They stay in the bag, moving around the plant, and it acts much in a way to protect the insect from the sprays that we would normally consider. By late summer, the mature caterpillars, they anchor their cocoons, they seal the bag, and they pupate. And then the adults will emerge. The males are dark-winged, females are wingless, and they actually resemble caterpillars. Where do they cover? Most states east of the Mississippi River. And the signs and symptoms are pretty obvious: defoliation of plants, and of course, hard to miss the bags that are hanging as well. Treatment, I will not go through at this time, but it's pretty much all the rest of it. The thing you have to consider as you're weighing what choices to make are which of the chemistries can get into the tree, into the leaves, to protect it from the inside while the insects are feeding. The bags are very impermeable to sprays. Next, we'll talk about the California oakworm. Obviously, it's a California pest. Most common on coastal live oak, but the severity will vary yearly. The life cycle is such that the adult moths are tan to gray with prominent wing veins, as you can see on the top left-hand side here. The male has feathery antenna, a little bit difficult to catch in this particular one, but the females are not very feathery. They lay eggs in groups of 24 to 36 on the undersides of leaves, as you can see in the picture here. The eggs will change color as they ripen to brown before they hatch after 3 weeks. At maturity, the larvae are only 1 inch in size after they're feeding. The pupal cases are very variable in color, and they're about 1/2 inch in size. They tend to suspend them from trees and any nearby objects, so they may be present anywhere. And you get 2 to 3 generations in California. So moths can be present anywhere between March and November as multiple generations occur. The fall spring generation, which means that this is a caterpillar that's present in the fall into the spring. The eggs are laid in the fall, they hatch in 3 weeks. They overwinter as young caterpillars on the undersides of leaves. 5 instars will mature into pupa by May, June. And this is the pupa on the left-hand side, just different variations in colors. With the moths emerging in the June, July time period, they lay new eggs, and those hatch into caterpillars which feed in July and September, which then pupate and fly and lay eggs. They also use their silken threads to move around, and actually, when threatened, will drop out of the trees. They range along the California coast and the coastal mountains, and they focus very heavily in the San Francisco and Monterey Bay area. Young oakworms will skeletonize the tops of leaves. So that's a first sign that you've got this caterpillar problem, but the older caterpillars will chew through leaves, which will then turn brown and die. The attacks that you see from the distance will make branches more visible, and that's how you can know, even from the distance, that you've got this pest foliating trees. And because of the summer generation, there may be renewed defoliation by mid to late summer. Again, multiple generations a year. They can really damage trees. If you notice here, California is severely drought stressed. These red areas indicate the worst of the droughts, but even the golden brown areas are drought stressed. So the more drought stressed the tree, the greater the risk to these trees. And if oaks defoliate, the larvae may then seek other plants to feed on. So it's not just oaks if the population's high enough. Treatments are all very much the same, but understanding the timing will help you to determine when you should be treating the trees. Okay, I'm going to take a quick break to sip some water. And moving on to one that also is not thought of as a caterpillar, the pitch mass borer. They attack mature ponderosas, Austrians, Eastern and Scots pine, Norway and blue spruce, quite a wide variety of conifers. The eggs are laid in the bark in early summer near a wound, a scar, or a crevice. And at the hatch out, the white-bodied larvae then bore into the tree. So this is not a leaf-feeding insect. This is a boring insect, feeding in the cambium and the xylem. They can feed for 2 to 3 years before they complete their life cycle, reaching only 1 inch in size before pupating in all of that copious pitch that they've caused to exude from the tree. So all of these signs that you're seeing here are indications that need you to explore what might be going on. And as you open up the pitch, you can actually see the caterpillars inside. Adult moths emerge in June as clear-winged, yellow jacket looking like wasps. And again, this is a very different pest than we're used to in most places. The range is Midwest east to southeastern Canada and New England south to the Appalachian Mountains. Some of the obvious signs of the copious sap exuding from the trees really should cause you to go up to the tree and figure out what's going on. The sap is often associated with a wound on the trunk, and the sap exudate, this is real important, changes from cream to pink, indicating a second generation attack. So if you look on the left here, this is a first generation attacking the tree. By the time it turns this pinkish color, this is a year old or potentially last year's outbreak. That may mean that the tree is still struggling, but is about to suffer from yet a second attack. and it could help you at indicating whether this tree is savable or not. Examining sap clumps can expose the white larva or sometimes a pupal casing. So how do you treat this particular pest? Well, bark sprays before the larvae enter the tree are possible. Permethrins and bifenthrins are some of the most commonly used, although they are short-lived, generally about 17 days outside of the tree. Injections, however, offer you the largest treatment window. Products like emamectin benzoate, like Triage, will work even after the attack begins because they are systemic and they're moving within the tree where these larvae are feeding. Now we come to one of my favorites, the spongy moth, which formerly was called the gypsy moth. I've done a lot of work with gypsy moths because they were so severe in New England just a few years ago. They have oaks as a preference, but they prefer white oaks if they can, and if they're not available, they'll attack beech. However, I mentioned earlier, in heavy attacks, they're willing to attack pretty much any pest, any plant at all, just to survive. The life cycle is very much tied to bud break and leaf expansion, typically late April to mid-May. Egg masses contain hundreds of eggs. Upon hatch, the larvae climb all the way up to the tops of trees. I've even seen them climb up to statuary and gardens, trying to balloon off on silken threads. And you can see in the right-hand picture here, the silken threads where these insects are at the top of a tree. This happens to be a conifer, not in any way associated with their normal hosts. The young larvae will feed at night, and by the time they mature, they will feed day and night. They have 4 instars over a 7-week period, but near pupation, the larvae will gather under the branches, and you can see them gathering here at the bottom right-hand side, and they pupate by late July. And they form their pupal cases directly under those branches as well. You can see on the left-hand side, this is one tree with countless egg masses from 2017 that were going to hatch that next spring. This was in the fall that I took that picture. And here's what the pupal cases look like as they gather on a tree. This actually happened to be a maple, not their preferred host, but the population was so high that they were grasping for whatever food they could find. And on the left-hand side, you can see one of the pupal cases that happens to be on a birch tree. Pupation takes about 10 to 14 days, then the moths emerge. The females remain on the tree because they can't fly. The males are attracted to the females and they fly all over the place in a very lazy, disconnected manner. The eggs are laid in August and then the moths die. So by the fall, you're able to tell just how severe the potential problem is the following spring. Their range is from the Northeast, west to Wisconsin, south to Virginia, and every year it's expanding, and some of the worst damage typically occurs at the edge of that expansion. However, if you've got a period of dry weather for a couple of springs in a row, you can expect a severe outbreak if they're in the area. The egg masses are visible in fall, so it's easier to predict the spring intensity of outbreak. The masses are buff to tan, about 3/4 of an inch in size. One of the reasons they've named it a spongy moth is because when you push on the egg mass, it's kind of spongy. The larva will change color with each stage. They're initially black, and the last stage has a very distinct set of blue dots and red dots and are hairy. I'll show you that in just a moment. Female moths are white, males are darker brown with wing striations. So there's the male on the left-hand side with the wing striations, and the female, again, that is flightless with the buff-covered egg mass that she's laying. Outbreaks are cyclical, often following dry spring seasons. And then these 2 biological agents I mentioned earlier often keep them in check otherwise. The virus NPV, also used in some forestry treatments by air, and the entomophaga fungi attack in wet springs. The setae often cause allergic reaction in human skin, not as severe as the brown-tailed moth, but I've had any number of caterpillars land on me during severe outbreaks and do get a rash as well. Sprays are very effective if your timing is right. You can use acephate, pyrethrins, or carbaryl. We did a number of experiments on my land here with emamectin benzoate, and acephate is often used in the spring in a particularly severe outbreak. I want to talk to you a little bit more about some notes. There are spring spray treatment issues: wind, rain, very little leaf surface for the insects to adhere to, but they can be present in such large numbers that they defoliate very, very quickly. Injection in fall is a viable option with long residual injections. I know this because we've done some experimenting on that and can talk to that in a moment. In severe cases, you might follow up with a spring treatment with acephate injected to control the ballooning caterpillars that are coming from trees that have never been treated. So let's talk about some of this research for a moment. I think this is worth your note. There was a fall treatment that we conducted in 2017 because we expected total defoliation in 2018. Some 60 trees were treated in the back of my property, mostly red oaks, a few white oaks. In this study, 78% of the red oak leaves were retained, while the check trees all around me were 100% defoliated. The attack trees also risk two-line chestnut borer and armillaria root rot attacks as they get weakened. And if I could show you pictures of this entire community, there are dead oaks everywhere, falling, standing, ready to be taken down. White oaks on my property suffered the most defoliation, but this is the interesting thing. They regained 70% of their leaves by September, while the red oaks, which were not treated, only regained 25% of their leaves. If you look at both of these pictures, this tree on the left is an old white oak, the tree on the right is a red oak, and the one on the left was treated, the one on the right was not, but the one on the left did suffer defoliation because of such severe infestations. And again, on the bottom right-hand side, you can see two trees next to each other, white oak on the left, red oak on the right, and you can see the difference that having had it protected made in its ability to refoliate by the fall. It's truly spectacular. We'll move on now to birch leaf miners. Not all birch is susceptible. Their primary hosts in the East in the United States are gray, paper, European, and white birch. The safest species is a river birch. And it's important to note, this is not a caterpillar, it's a European sawfly. But the damage is so much like a caterpillar, I thought it worth mentioning. They overwinter as pre-pupa. The adults emerge at leaf out, so late May to early June. And the adult is a small black fly, as you can see in the bottom left-hand side here. The females will oviposit eggs singly into slits they cut into the leaves near the tips of branches, like you can see in the bottom right-hand side. More than one egg can be laid per leaf by multiple females, but typically one egg per female per leaf. Eggs hatch to legless, worm-like larvae feeding between leaf surfaces, and they create mines. You can see how caterpillar-like this is by looking at the center bottom picture. Immature leaf miners feed for several weeks, then drop to the ground to pupate. They can remain in the soil and overwinter that way, but very often we'll see a second generation and sometimes even a third, though the first generation is almost always the most severe. Interestingly enough, most of the black adults are actually females. There is an amber marked birch leaf miner in some areas in northern regions, but birch leaf miner is present in most parts of the United States. Adults are difficult to spot. They're a very tiny black fly, and their oviposit sites may be visible as little marks in the leaves. The first generation, as I said, does most of the damage, but trees under stress are the most negatively impacted. If you have birch trees growing in the woods as an understory where they naturally grow, they tend to suffer far less damage because they're not already under stress. Early feeding can be stopped, but fully mined leaves are likely to fall off the tree. As you can see on the right-hand side here, that leaf is not staying on the tree. Timing is critical because spring leaf emergence depends on temperature. I've actually found birch trees on one side of a property in the sun, ready to treat, and on the other side, still in bud. So it's really difficult in the spring to treat trees for birch leaf miner. Fall treatments are ideal with long-lasting products like emamectin. Spring systemics can provide you the protection if your timing is right. And of course, there's also spinosad as an option as well. Moving on to tussock moth. As if there weren't enough caterpillars we've already talked about. The host plants, wide species list, birch, oak, cherry, apple fir. There are different tussock moths all across the country. In most areas, they have one generation a year, and sometimes in the deep south, you might see 2 generations. They overwinter as eggs, as you can see at the bottom, and they hatch from cocoons, which are covered in irritating hairs, and these are visible in the spring, up in the top right-hand side. Early instars feed on remaining egg mass, which is quite interesting. So you can see how they're feeding in the top left-hand side to devour the rest of the egg mass. And then they'll spin threads to balloon for dispersal, much like so many other caterpillars. Egg masses are often laid on non-plant material. So ballooning actually helps them to get to food because they may be laid on something that there is no food available for them. Going through 4 to 5 instars, they'll pupate in the late spring. Adult moths emerge in summer. The females are flightless. Seems to be a common issue with many of these caterpillars. So males use pheromones to find the females. The females release the pheromones and the males are attracted to them. Females will lay the eggs on whatever surface their pupa hatched because they are not flying, and they overwinter as eggs in most species. Again, the different species will have different ranges, but they cover the entire United States. Importantly, as a way of denoting which types of moths the tussock moth are, the caterpillars have 4 tuft groups, usually white, barbed, irritating, they call them urticating, hairs mid-body, and you can see that in the image on the top right. They also have groups of pencil or longer hairs extending forward and back from segments of the body, as you can see in the center and on the left-hand side. And of course, they do also cause irritation to humans. The color of the larva will vary from light to dark, stripes on the sides, orange to yellow dots, but it's those tufts of hair that are the most consistent among the various species. The moths are small, the males are dull with prominent antennae. Some male species have a slightly purple wing color, and you can see that in the bottom right. What are the treatment options? Again, early spring, there's a wide range of choices, or fall applications of longer lasting residuals will help protect your trees. Again, if you're looking for shorter residuals, you can treat in the spring. If you're looking for longer residuals with timing not an issue, you'll treat in the fall. The variable oakleaf caterpillar is called variable because it is. This is an interesting one as well. A wide variety of deciduous trees with oaks preferred and white oaks preferred more than red. When the oaks are limited, beech are actually preferred, and significant outbreaks are not all that common, but they have caused severe defoliation in the past. The moths are 1 to 2 inches with some distinctive markings. They typically are ash gray in color. You can see that on the left-hand side. They're active late spring to summer, similar to what most other caterpillars are, but the moths are present laying their eggs during that time period. Females lay these tiny light green eggs in clusters of 50 or more under the leaves, as you can see on the right-hand side. Eggs hatch in 1 to 2 weeks, turning spotted purple before hatch. So these are getting close to hatch in this picture. The life cycle is this. Tiny spotted larvae will feed together on the lower surfaces near eggs, the remaining eggshells, skeletonizing a few leaves near the hatch out site. And then as they begin to molt, they start to feed singly. You can see the severe damage that a large population can cause from these pictures. They have 5 instars before pupating in the soil by the late summer. Larvae are very variable, and this is one of the reasons they call them variable oakleaf caterpillar. From place to place, the coloration of the larva is distinctly different. They prepupate in silk-lined cells that are in the leaf litter and become inactive through the winter. There's the pupa in the bottom left-hand side. Pupation in the spring heralds the moth's emergence, and then some can even remain pre-pupa for yet another year. So they may remain inactive for 2 seasons and then eventually continue on with hatching into adults. They cover most of the US and Eastern Canada, actually into Mexico as well. You can see some of the differences among these caterpillars here, how variable they truly are. And the frequency and number of the clusters of skeletonized leaves in the fall will dictate the degree of defoliation to come. As the larvae grow, they change color. At maturity, they're mostly green with pink to red tones, as you can see in the top left-hand side. The larval body has a dark red band along its length, which is pretty obvious there, with yellow lines along the sides. So they are quite variable. And all of the other treatment options, as we've talked about, are available for you. We're getting close to the end here. I know we're getting close to the time frame, so we'll move along and talk about Western tent caterpillar. You'll never guess where this is, primarily in the Western states, but it attacks alder, cottonwood, willow, hawthorn, aspen, fruit trees, just a slew of different pests. Again, the egg mass looks very similar to eastern tent caterpillar, as you can see on the top left-hand side. It encircles a branch with a hard, glossy substance. The eggs hatch in the spring. Then the caterpillars begin to feed as the trees break bud. They feed in silken nests, which enlarge as the caterpillars mature, which takes about 30 to 40 days. And there's just one generation a year. But after several instars, they begin to feed solitarily. They pupate and adults emerge in the summer. Pupation only takes 12 days in the cocoons, and they're spun on branches of trees or litter. The adults emerge late July to early August, and the male and female moths are strong flyers, which is quite different since many of the female moths do not fly at all in many other species. And the swarms of these moths are quite common in the western states. Eggs are laid in clasping masses on the twigs, much as the eastern tent caterpillar does. And the female will lay a single egg mass on these branches, which take about 2 to 4 weeks to hatch, but remain in egg form until spring. Where is their range? Western states to Texas, Western Canada to Quebec to the Rockies. So they seem to move further east when you get up into Canada, but primarily in the United States, they're in the western states. The adults are very heavy-bodied moths with a 1 to 2 inch wingspan, as you can see here. These are quite unique among these moths. Moth coloration varies from red, brown to yellow, tan, or gray, but these are quite unique moths. What are the signs and symptoms? Well, the forewings have a perpendicular line. I'll go back one slide and show you that. You can see these lines on the wings, very unique. The young larvae are dark brown to black with whitish hairs. The mature larvae are pale blue with a mid-dorsal stripe, as you can see here on this top left-hand side, and orange hairs with white tips. The cocoons are white silk, dusted white to yellow powder, and that's visible on the right-hand side. So what do? Well, on fruit trees, you can remove the egg masses, and that can be done manually once the eggs are laid. But for you as professionals, you're going to need to prepare to treat the following year. Organics, biopesticides, sprays in the spring, injections in the fall can all help you. But remember, they're nest builders, so sprays are the most difficult to get through these nests. Elm spanworm. Have we not finished? We have not. The elm spanworm attacks elms. Hickories, oaks, red sugar maple, American beech, and ash. Life cycle. What is this life cycle? In July, the female moths lay eggs in single layered masses under twigs, branches, and trunks. The females lay a lot of eggs, 250 or so, which overwinter as eggs. After they hatch, the larvae go through 5 to 6 instars, and then they pupate. The larvae spin coarse net-like cocoons of silken threads on partly defoliated leaves and branch tips. Pupa only stay a short while before the adults emerge in midsummer. But the moths are night flyers. Again, you're not going to see them unless they're attracted to your lights. The range is the eastern United States. The eggs are oblong, as you can see here, with white serrated rings, but they're typically yellow-green when laid in the summer, darkening by winter. Adult moths are quite long, 1.5 inches or so, with a stout, hairy body. You can see that moth up here. Mature larvae are a full 2 inches long, dull black with a red rusted head, visible over here on the top right-hand side. They do have a color variant as a green body with a yellow head at the bottom. So there are some variations from place to place. And the pupa are light brown with brown spots. Bottom left-hand side, you can see the pupa cases. Treatment options, like most other caterpillar, are organics, botanicals, and injectables with long residuals. Western spruce budworm, very similar. Douglas fir, true fir, spruce, large pines. The difference here is that they're not feeding on the leaves. They're feeding inside the stems. 1 generation a year with 4 life stages. The female moths are laying egg masses of 150 or more under the host tree needles. Again, primarily a feeder of conifers. The eggs hatch soon after, and the first instar don't feed. Instead, they seek shelter to overwinter in the trees. So they create shelters, they molt, and they spend the winter as second instar larvae. This is quite different than many. In the spring, the larvae will emerge. They'll mine old needles, as you can see here in the top right-hand side, and then tunnel into the swelling buds, as you can see in the bottom right-hand side. Feeding will continue as they expand to new growth. They construct silk and web shelters. And the shelter among the needles contain partially chewed needles and frass. They just look messy when you look at these branches. They also feed on flowers, new cones, and can cut shoots on the larch trees. As the mature larvae develop over a 30 to 40 day period, this typically occurs after they've left their overwintering sites. They pupate in July near larval shelters, takes about 10 days. And then after emerging from their pupal cases, this is interesting because females will remain close to where they emerge from the pupal cases. They will then use pheromones to attract males. Once they've mated, they'll deposit half their eggs there and then fly off to deposit the rest of the eggs before they eventually die. They're visible and evident through the western US, the Pacific Northwest, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, Idaho, and Montana. What is common in many larvae, they will wiggle together when disturbed. So if you see them and you move your hand over them, they will actually wiggle, then drop to lower areas. Those that drop onto lower needles will continue to feed. Those that fall on the ground die. They're always present at low levels between outbreaks, but weakened trees are the most susceptible to the attacks of these insects and then to bark beetles, which of course exacerbates the wildfire risk. So they are all interconnected in their impact on these trees. Treatment options are broad, but in general, injection is preferred. However, in particularly drought-stressed areas, this is where you want to look at protecting these trees from the potential for bark beetles to attack them as well. Okay, we're done with the pests. Let's go on to the last few slides. I like to use cheat sheets, phenology charts, and pest alerts to help me figure out what's coming. Arborjet has many of these available to you, but so do your extension services. Charts exist to match pest or disease and season of treatment with solutions. You can create your own to show pest hatches, disease outbreaks, and the right windows for treatment in your market. Seasonal pics help. One of the things I found is that if you take pictures throughout the spring of the various stages of your plant development, you'll know whether you're early or late and can expect insects to be early or late and therefore time your treatments otherwise. For instance, I know that in the Northeast right now, where I live, the oak trees are easily a week to 2 weeks later than they should be. We can show you how to evaluate problems and how to apply the science and common sense to identify these kinds of issues. Now, often when you get a call from a customer, it's more like a 911 because a tree looks unwell. And the natural inclination is to come in and make a diagnosis. That's what you're there for. But it can be a mistake because there are often abiotic factors that trigger the weakening of the tree to make it more susceptible. Pre-existing conditions often allow decline to develop. You may see the symptom of a deeper issue, which you've got to uncover before you offer sound advice to help that tree recover. And remember, not all pests require treatment. Some may be simply aesthetic, and really more of a nuisance, not injurious to the tree at all. But sometimes it's more of a nuisance pest that the customer wants protected, not the tree at risk calls that you'll face. We have a number of resources to help you, including this sheet that will tell you which of the products are best for which of the pests and how to help you to choose the right products that you need to protect trees. And we have a functional educational website for both your people and your clients. Among our team, there are decades of experience, ISA certified arborists, master arborists, certified agronomists, and even sports turf specialists. On our YouTube channel, there are dozens of videos, and we offer 100 webinars similar to this one annually. We have a winter series that you may or may not have been involved in the past on a diverse group of subjects, and tech support is simply a phone call away, and we do offer CEU training much as today. Between the pest sheets, the pest guides, and downloadable literature, there's certainly a resource for you to call on, and that's what we'd like you to remember about Arborjet. So just a quick note on images. Not all of these images are my own. Some of them were taken from this amazing website, bugwood.org, others from Wikipedia and Google. It is impossible to have enough pictures of every pest to do a suitable job. I just want to acknowledge the support of all of these people who have done all of these amazing picture taking and recognize them at this point. To reach one of us, there's a whole slew of ways you can do that. Our phone number, You can reach us online by going to Arborjet, our team, regional technical and sales managers, to find one of our team closest to you. You can email us at info@Arborjet. You can reach out to me or to the regional technical manager that manages the entire team, and that's Trent Dix. Just let us know what we can do to help you with the business. And I believe that concludes the presentation.